And so the French Revolution was carried out according to the plan that was laid down by Mayer Amschel Rothschild in Frankfurt in 1773, including the Reign of Terror and the use of sedition and la infamie at the Palais Royal, and the propaganda that was used and all the strategies that were outlined by Rothschild. And by 1800 they had control of the central bank of France. And in 1803 the Napoleonic Wars began, and so Napoleon began expanding around Europe, and King Wilhelm of Hesse was afraid of Napoleon's army. And so between Mayer Amschel Rothschild and Nathan Rothschild, who was living in London, they moved all of his wealth to London, where Nathan looked after it.
Mayer oversaw the taxes collected in Wilhelm's lands and had to keep his money safe, a task that became very difficult in 1806. That is the year when Napoleon invaded Hesse, driving Wilhelm into exile and putting his fortune at risk. But Mayer was smart, and he was ready for Napoleon. In 1798 he had sent one of his 5 sons, Nathan Rothschild, to London to start a currency business similar to his father's. With this foundation in place, Mayer had no trouble moving Wilhelm's fortune to London, where he then loaned it out to the British Crown. In essence, Wilhelm was funding the British to fight Napoleon in order to restore his power. Now Mayer died in 1812, leaving Wilhelm's fortune and the Rothschild legacy in the hands of Nathan. He remained in London, while his eldest brother took over the original Frankfurt business. Meanwhile, the 3 remaining brothers scattered throughout Europe, establishing branches in important European capitals. Despite the distance, the brothers applied a unified strategy. They would loan out their money to the aristocracy and to local governments. The brother in France, for example, became the banker of Leopold I of Belgium, while the one in Vienna would lend money to the last Holy Roman Emperor, Francis II. In 1818, he would grant all 5 brothers the noble title of Baron, finally elevating the Rothschilds to nobility.
And so the Rothschilds, who were court Jews, became part of the nobility around Europe. And by the time of the Battle of Waterloo, 4 of the sons were lending money on each side of the war to the Germans and the Dutch and the English and the French.
I think the edge over families like the Barings with whom they were competing was that they had their brothers in very important financial centres and countries. Now, whether that was premeditated, whether they thought that through as they got out of the ghetto, it's hard to believe that they went as far as that. But that's what happened, and once they saw that it was an advantage, I think they worked on that advantage.
This is how it really happened. Selling bonds to the public had raised plenty of cash for the British government. But neither bonds nor banknotes were any use to Wellington. To provision his troops and pay Britain's allies against France, he needed a currency that was universally acceptable. Nathan Rothschild was given the job of taking the money raised in the bond market and delivering it to Wellington as gold. The success of this operation would determine the fate of the warring empires and of all Europe.
This letter marks a turning point in the history of both the Rothschild family and the British government. It's dated the 11th of January 1814, and it's an order from the Chancellor of the Exchequer to the Commissary-in-Chief, telling him to appoint Nathan Rothschild, Mr. Rothschild, as a British government agent. Nathan's job was to gather together as much gold and silver as he could find on the European continent and make sure that it got to the Duke of Wellington and his army, who had just fought their way out of Spain into the south of France. It was an operation that relied heavily on the Rothschilds' unique pan-European credit network, and also on Nathan's ability to mobilize gold the way Wellington could mobilize troops.
Shifting such vast amounts of gold in the middle of a war was hugely risky, of course. Yet from the Rothschilds' point of view, the hefty commissions they were able to charge more than justified the risks. The Rothschilds soon became indispensable to the British war effort. In the words of the British Commissary-in-Chief, Rothschild of this place has executed the various services entrusted to him in this line admirably well, and though a Jew, we place a good deal of confidence in him. The Rothschilds were so effective as war financiers because they had a ready-made banking network within the family. Nathan in London, Amschel in Frankfurt, James in Paris, Karl in Amsterdam, and Salomon roving wherever Nathan saw fit. If the price of gold was higher in, say, Paris than in London, James in Paris would sell, and Nathan in London would buy. In March 1815, Napoleon returned to Paris from exile in Elba, determined to revive his imperial ambitions. On the morning of June the 18th, 1815, 67,000 British, Dutch and German troops under the Duke of Wellington's command looked out across the fields of Waterloo, not far from Brussels, towards an almost equal number of French troops, commanded by the French Emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte. The Battle of Waterloo was the culmination of more than 2 decades of intermittent conflict between Britain and France. But it was more than just a battle between 2 armies. It was also a contest between rival financial systems. One, the French, based on plunder. The other, the British, based on debt. To pay for the war, the British government had sold an unprecedented amount of bonds. According to a long-standing legend, the Rothschild family made their first millions by speculating on how the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo would affect the price of these bonds. Wellington famously called the Battle of Waterloo the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life. After a day of brutal charges, counter-charges and heroic defense, the late arrival of the Prussian army finally proved decisive. For Wellington, it was a glorious victory. No doubt it was gratifying to Nathan Rothschild to be the first to hear the news of Napoleon's defeat. Thanks to the swiftness of the Rothschild couriers, he heard it fully 48 hours before Major Henry Percy delivered Wellington's official dispatch to the British cabinet.
And Nathan Rothschild said sometime after the Battle of Waterloo, "I care not what puppet is placed upon the throne of England to rule the empire upon which the sun never sets. The man who controls Britain's money supply controls the British Empire, and I control the British money supply." And Nathan Rothschild took control of the British money supply in that 48 hours between the time that he found out that Napoleon had lost the Battle of Waterloo to the time that the British public had found out. And in the meantime he went down to the Royal Exchange and stood by his pillar and began selling the government bonds that he had. And that created a crash in the bond market. And by the time the public and the British government found out that they had won the Battle of Waterloo, he was already buying up the bonds at a discounted price. And so that amassed a huge amount of wealth for the Rothschilds in London. And by the end of the 19th century, the Rothschilds virtually controlled all the money supply throughout Europe and were the equivalent of the International Monetary Fund today.
Throughout the next decades, whenever a European government collapsed and was replaced, it was the Rothschilds who were first in line to provide loans. The loaning business was immensely successful. The Paris branch, for example, grew from the equivalent of $5 million in 1820 to over $500 million in 1850. In essence, the 5 Rothschild banking families back then provided the same service that the International Monetary Fund provides today. They stabilized major currencies and provided loans to governments, doing both at a great profit.